just make the point that we welcome Graham again to give a repeat presentation of his webinar on the cheetahs. And I note that we have some very stiff competition in terms of Liberal and Labor rallies and Friends of the ABC webinars, and goodness knows what else is going on this afternoon, which kind of takes the oxygen out of just about everything. So I'm glad the five of us are here, so we may have others joining in, and the presentation will be recorded, will be on the Friends website afterwards. So Graham, over to you.
The Mcdonald Sisters are best known today for the 4 feature films they made in Sydney between 1926 and 1932. In the late 1930s, 3 of those films were acclaimed as stylish melodramas with an international look and professionalism. The fact that the coming of sound spelt an end to the Mcdonald's success and therefore their careers has been recognised as something of a tragedy. But it was also characteristic of the Australian production industry in the 1920s and 30s, when ongoing support and mentorship of talented filmmakers was in short supply. By the 1970s, there were 2 myths about the Mcdonald sisters. The first was that as wealthy society women, they could easily afford to make films, and that their period of filmmaking was a way station in lives of uninterrupted wealth. The second myth was that the McDonalds made those films just after leaving school. Both these claims were not only untrue, but concealed other realities. The McDonald sisters' father was Scots-born Dr. John McDonagh, who ran a medical practice in College Street, Sydney. The sisters' mother was Anita Jeanette, or Annie McDonagh, née Amora, who had a Chilean family background. In 1896, she met Dr. McDonagh after he was injured in an accident, and she nursed him in hospital. They were married in 1897, and their oldest child, Isabel, was born in 1899. Isabel was followed in 1900 by Phyllis, and the next year by Paulette. Among his civic activities, Dr. McDonagh was honorary surgeon for J.C. Williamson Theatres. As Isabel, Phyllis, and Paulette moved through their childhood and teenage years, Dr. and Mrs. McDonagh ran weekly at-home soirees for Australian and overseas actors. The sisters became avid theatre fans and soon film fans, with a liking for American feature films, especially dramas. Paulette McDonagh saw some of the same films repeatedly, often on a single day. She studied how the most impactful of those films drew their emotional power from framing and editing. The death of Dr. McDonagh in January 1920 was soon followed by the discovery that by then his wealth had ebbed away. That same year, to make ends meet, Annie McDonagh bought the historic mansion, Drummoyne House, in the Sydney suburb of Drummoyne. She intended to use some of the house as a convalescent hospital, which she would run with Isabel. Also sharing the house with Annie and her 7 children was Dr. McDonagh's substantial collection of paintings and luxury furnishings, a collection which the family at this stage couldn't bear to part with. Annie and Isabel McDonagh ran the Drummoyne House nursing home for several years. This activity abruptly ended with the death of Annie McDonagh in March 1924. The £1,000 the Mcdonald sisters used for the making of their first film, Those Who Love, in 1926, came from the estate of their father. 2 of the sisters already had filmmaking experience. Isabel had appeared in the Australian film Joe, directed by Beaumont Smith, as well as a couple of other silent films in which she had lesser roles. In the meantime, Paulette wrote feature film scripts, attended the film school run by Sydney filmmaker P.J. Ramster, and worked as an extra in Arthur Shirley's film of 1925, The Mystery of a Hansom Cab. At the time they began making Those Who Love, the sisters were far from being just out of school. In 1926, Isabel was 27, Paulette was 25, and Phyllis was 26. Work on each of their silent films began with the sisters collaborating on a story outline. After that, Paulette wrote a first draft script, which Phyllis then helped to refine. Phyllis's contribution also included the writing of intertitles on their films, and during production, Paulette was director, and Phyllis was art director, production manager and publicist, and Isabel played the leading role in all three of the McDonagh silent films and was also in the cast of their final film, 2 Minute Silence. The story of Those Who Love hinges around the wealthy parents' projection of two women in succession who have been chosen by their son as a partner. When the son is injured at work, the second woman, his wife, played by Isabel McDonagh, billed as Marie-Lorraine, pleads with the parents to finance his medical treatment. The parents initially refuse, but change their minds when they meet the young grandson and recognise the genuine love between wife and husband. Paulette initially offered co-direction of Those Who Love to her film school tutor, PJ Ramster. However, Paulette soon disagreed with Ramster's departures from her script and she took over as sole director. When Those Who Love was released, Ramster was credited as co-director since the several films he had made previously had been released and well publicised. Those Who Love was filmed in 10 days at Drummoyne House, as well as at the Australasian Film Studios at Bondi Junction and locations around Sydney. The film and The Far Paradise were able to showcase Drummoyne House's opulent settings and furniture. On each of the silent films, Phyllis McDonagh, as art director and production manager, was able to persuade the family's social contacts and business people to provide the film's free use of settings, furniture, clothing, cars, and offices. Cameraman Jack Fletcher, seen here on the left, who had worked briefly at Paramount Studios in Hollywood, proved to be an excellent cameraman. He knew exactly how to use framing and lighting to enhance the mood of the images Paulette had in mind. On the release of Those Who Love in September 1926, the film was highly praised. The Adelaide Register called it a triumph for the Australian industry, both in the light of quality of photographic work and in the general production of the story. In later years, the sisters claimed Those Who Love had earned more money in Australia than Charles Chaplin's The Gold Rush. The McDonaghs earned £4,000 from Those Who Love. Aside from what appears to be a short trailer, Those Who Love is now very unfortunately a lost film. Both The Far Paradise and The Cheetahs were again about young love challenged by parental prejudice. In The Far Paradise, much of the conflict revolves around a daughter's protection of and loyalty to her father, who, initially unknown to her, is a shady businessman, ultimately accused of murder. The budget for The Far Paradise was £2,000. The film was again shot in 2 weeks at Drummoyne House and at the Bondi Junction studio. Other locations included Penrith, the Burragarang Valley, and Melbourne. What survives of The Far Paradise allows the viewer to appreciate the strength of Isabel as a silent screen actress. Indeed, she invested moments that could otherwise have been superficial with a deep emotional truth. The Far Paradise earned less money than Those Who Love. Before the making of their final silent, The Cheetahs, scarcity of money forced the McDonagh family to sell Drummoyne House. The Cheetah storyline begins with a married man, Bill Marsh, being sent to prison after embezzling funds from his employer. After his release, Marsh builds up a gang of thieves whose members include his daughter Paula, played by Isabel McDonagh. When Marsh assigns Paula to steal from guests at a high-class country hotel, she meets and falls in love with Lee Travers, adopted son of businessman John Travers, who had originally sent Marsh to prison. Paula becomes conflicted over continuing her life of crime. After this, events spiral out of her and her father's control. The budget for The Cheetahs came from former grazier Neville Mackin, seated on the left here. The filming of the silent version of the Cheetahs took 5 weeks at the Bondi Junction studio and locations in and around Sydney. As with the 2 previous films, leading roles were played mostly by experienced actors, and smaller roles were played by the McDonagh's friends and acquaintances. The Cheetahs entered production in June 1929, nearly 2 years after the American talkie The Jazz Singer had rapidly transformed the global film business from silent to sound films. At the end of 1929, when the McDonaghs attempted to sell the Cheetahs to an Australian film trade adapting to American talkies, it was rejected, simply as a silent film. In March 1930, at Vocalion Records in Melbourne, the McDonaghs filmed 3 sound-on-disc sequences for the Cheetahs, along with an orchestral score. The first of these talkie sequences to appear in the film was a breakfast table scene between 2 of the gang, Paula with the fictitious Lady Worth, played by Leal Douglas. The second was a song performed by Paula in this scene, and the third was the film's concluding scene. The McDonaghs hoped that by turning the Cheetahs into a part talkie would improve the market appeal of the film and maximise its chances of winning the federal government's new £10,000 competition for Best Australian Film. The Cheetahs failed to win first prize in the competition. The sound-on-disc version screened to a preview audience on the 1st of June 1930, an occasion whose impact was ruined by audience laughter when sound monitoring and playback went haywire. The sound-on-disc version of the Cheetahs is said to have been screened publicly at the St Kilda Palais in the early 1930s, although I've been unable to find evidence to confirm that it actually was. After that screening, if it did occur, the sound-on-disc version vanished, with the exception of a single disc of music now held by the NFSA. All that survives visually of the reshot sound-on-disc sequences are 2 stills, also held by the NFSA. Those 2 stills show Paula and the bogus Lady Worth. Well, we don't have that still, unfortunately. Those stills show Paula and the bogus Lady Worth having breakfast and Paula at the piano. In 1931, the McDonaghs worked with Neville Mackin, who had financed the development of Standard Tone, a sound-on-disc film. In 1931, the McDonaghs worked with Neville Mackin, who had financed the development of Standard Tone, a sound-on-film recording process, to add a soundtrack to all of the Cheetahs. This full talkie conversion involved adding several new scenes, reshooting some of the film's close-ups, and dubbing the remainder of the silent version with dialogue, effects and music. The new scenes included a new opening in which detectives outside Darlinghurst Police Station discussed the need to arrest Bill Marsh, a montage establishing CBD Sydney, a reshoot of the breakfast scene, and scenes filmed in the lobby of Australia's Hotel, which is seen here on screen. Although in October 1931, the sound-on-film version of the Cheetahs was announced as being available for hire, I found no evidence that it ever had a public screening. After the three versions of the Cheetahs, Neville Mackin commissioned the McDonaghs to make around 5 short documentaries, mostly on sporting subjects. All of these films were screened in Australian cinemas. 2 Minutes Silence was the team's first feature, conceived from the outset as a full talkie. As an anti-war play, 2 Minutes Silence had premiered at the Community Playhouse in Sydney in July 1930. The play and later the film began with 4 people gathered in London in a drawing room to observe the customary 2 minutes silence on Armistice Day. The ensuing flashbacks showed each of the 4 people experiencing traumatic events, injustice and suffering during World War I. The £1,500 budget for 2 Minutes Silence was provided by businessman Charles Stewart. It was a tiny amount for a film needing to hire a studio and crew, sound-on-film recording technology and well-known stage actors. Shooting extended off and on at a small studio at the Sydney Showground from May to October 1932. The reason for the film's stop-start schedule was the spasmodic availability of several of its leading actors. Pursuing her usual goal of naturalistic acting, Paulette had to work particularly hard to subdue what were initially some overly theatrical performances from her actors. Two Minute Silence had mixed reviews, with the poet and critic Kenneth Slezzer finding it powerful and convincing. It was not a box office success because, in the opinion of Paulette in later years, it was too true for a lot of people. Today, the film is completely lost. On 14th September 1932, Isabel McDonagh married Charles Stewart, the man who had financed 2 Minute Silence. After appearing in that film, Isabel retired from filmmaking. She and Charles were to have 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. In fact, this is Charles, Sandra and Alan Stewart, photographed in London in 2009. Paulette next worked with Phyllis on a screenplay about the pioneering Australian flying doctor, John Flynn. Until late 1934, Paulette, Phyllis and their brother John continued their attempts to raise money for that film. But when the money proved elusive, Phyllis moved to New Zealand to work as a journalist. In the absence of Phyllis and Isabel, Paulette saw no point in continuing with films. "Isn't it funny," she recalled in the 1970s, "from that moment on, I didn't try. I didn't want to, I suppose." Okay. So back to me for a moment. In the early 1970s, the rediscovery of the Mcdonald Sisters came initially through screenings of the Cheetahs in the Far Paradise via the National Library's Film Study Collection. In 1975, the Cheetahs were screened at the Sydney Film Festival and at the International Women's Film Festival, all in all state capitals. In 1978, Phyllis travelled to Perth to accept the AFI's presentation of the Raymond Longford Award to the Mcdonald Sisters. Paulette died on the 29th of August 1978, just over a week after the presentation, and Phyllis passed away on the 17th of October that same year. Isabel, who in the early 1960s had moved to London with her children, died on the 5th of March 1982. In 2017, the NFSA digitally restored the silent version of the Cheetahs in a joint project with Harker Film Digital. Before and after its screening at the Sydney Film Festival on Wednesday, the 5th of June 2019, I met an impressive number of McDonald descendants. They included nieces and nephews, and the great-nieces and great-nephews of Paulette, Isabel and Phyllis. All I spoke with were enthusiastic or knowledgeable about multiple aspects of the Mcdonald Sisters story. Through recent film festival screenings of the restored Cheetahs, the McDonalds have received international recognition on a scale which in their lifetime might have seemed unimaginable. Since 2018, the film has screened at festivals including those of Melbourne, Sydney and London, and was also screened at New York's Museum of Modern Art in January 2020. Okay, I'll just go back, I hope, to right, okay. I'm just going to have to share the screen again, so right. Okey-doke. I've just got to move on. Right. Okay. I'd like now to screen 3 clips for the 1931 sound version of the Cheetahs, which are available on the NFSA's Australian Screen Online website. The first segment is the CBD Sydney montage, which leads to the sequence in which Paula and her bogus mother swindle a jewellery store. In fact, they swindled a jewellery store out of a valuable necklace. In the montage, Sydney is not named, and the music score calls to mind a sophisticated European city. The jewellery store sequence quite obviously combines shots from the silent version with close-ups newly filmed at the Standard Tone studio at Sydney Showground.
See that the meeting is called for Tuesday at 11 and ask Mr. Fraser to report to me. Yes, yes.
Lady Worth and her daughter to see you, sir.
Oh, indeed.
They're outside now.
Yes.
I think it's in connection with the Lee necklace.
Why, of course, Paul. I'll see them immediately.
Yes, very well, sir.
Show them in.
Very good.
Come in.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
My daughter. How do you do?
Delighted. Won't you be seated? Lovely weather?
Yes.
What can I do for you?
My daughter admires the necklace. Mother, I tell you, I will have. Mr. Mangan, it's my birthday, and I know Daddy would never refuse me.
Why, naturally. And how may I be of service?
Would you call him?
With pleasure, Miss
Central
Worth.
9.
Right. Central 9, please. Yes. Sir David? Marion of Roxley speaking. Lady Worth and your daughter are with me. They would like a word with you, sir. Yes, sir. Very good.
That you, Daddy, dear? Mother and I have chosen our present. A wonderful pearl necklace. It's beautiful. 2,000. Oh, but I must have it. Oh, don't refuse me, Daddy. You will? Oh, you darling. Yes, I'm sure he will. Daddy has attended a meeting, but suggests I bring the necklace to his office. Mother could wait here for me. I'll only be away a few minutes.
Well, Miss Worth, you realize this is rather an unusual request. It is not our custom to allow jewelers to leave the shop.
Oh, but Mr. Mangan, this is different.
I realize that.
Okay, segment 2. The second sequence shows the Paula Marsh character expressing second thoughts to her father after the jewellery store theft. Aside from adding sound to the Cheetahs, the 1931 version also condensed many of the silent version's individual sequences, such as this one. This second segment also has its soundtrack entirely dubbed rather than reshot.
Entree.
You get them, Miss Paula.
Why, of course, Dan.
Well,
what a cracker, Jack.
Absolutely not a foul of
Like taking candy from a kid.
Well, cheerio, boys. It's been a great day.
What about cheerio?
Have a smoke.
Yes, thanks. I think I need one. Just what I deserve.
Oh, where'd you do?
And a match, thanks. Oh, you should have seen the old buffer.
Yes, the boys certainly pulled the detective stunt very well.
Yes, Lady Worth. No, Lady Worth. I thought he'd be the death of
He had
me.
certainly put it over him. There he goes again.
Yes, take a look at them. Sometimes I wonder if it's worthwhile.
My dear, success is not lightly purchased. Courage is a virtue the young cannot spare. Clever fingers.
My dear, just take a look at this. We stirred up a hornet's nest this time. But I'd take the chance any day for another Lee necklace.
Perhaps Miss Paula could disappear until the scare dies down.
Yes. And this?
Mrs. Nash is holidaying at the plaza. Her jewels are said to be unique.
The air of the plaza should prove exhilarating for my daughter.
Okay, the third sequence shows Paula preparing for an evening at the hotel she's travelled to. In the hotel's dining room, she sees for the first time a society matron wearing the string of pearls her father has asked her to steal. A fellow guest introduces Paula to Lee Travers, after which Paula and Lee drive into the countryside.
Flowers from Miss Manners.
Someone has left these flowers for you, madame. Shall I arrange them? That will be all, Maureen. Very well. Count Beckman. Oh. I don't know. They don't touch this afternoon, you know. Oh, I don't know. I think it's a very good camera. What's the beautiful thing? I just thought it was because I saw funny things. Oh, no. Oh, the garden.
Well, I'll have to be getting back. Here he is. Well, just very nice. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Ah, you have arrived.
Aren't they lovely?
Not too beautiful for you. Shall we go in?
It was charming of you to think of me.
Ah, that was my pleasure.
Quite a gay crowd this evening.
Yes, you will choose something, a little caviar? No? Some hors d'oeuvre then. Hors d'oeuvre, if you please, waiter.
Yes.
And you will send the drink waiters, if you please.
Wait, table for three.
All right, I'm awfully sorry I was late. I loved it.
That is fine. Finally.
Mrs. Smith wanted to join her in the evening. Yes. I really think it would be a very good idea. It should be really most enjoyable. Is that Mrs. Hugh Nash? Oh, how do you do? Come back from my dear.
That is Mr. and Mrs. Nash and her daughter.
Oh.
Being early, going to a show?
Yes, we're running late now.
I'll see you out.
Right there.
Ah, Lee Travers, how are you, my friend? Mr. Manners, Mrs. Manners.
How do you do?
How do you do?
You will dine with us, Lee Travers. Yes, you must.
Do join us, won't you?
Thanks, I'd love to. Wait for a chair, please.
Are you staying here for long?
Oh, I hope you'll be here a week or two.
My friend and I have not met in years.
No, it's a long while. Yes.
Do you really think so? Who's the pretty girl with Count Beckman? Oh, she has caused quite a stir. Yes, hasn't she? Yes. I'm enjoying every moment.
Yes, it's a fine place.
It's been nice meeting you here like this.
Sure, we're going to have a fine...
Okay, so here we are. That basically is the talk, and I'd just like to open it up to any questions that you might have about the McDonalds, or in particular the Cheetahs, any of the three versions of the Cheetahs. Be interested in your thoughts.
What fascinates me is the cleverness with which they dubbed voices in the silent scenes. You know, it's really done quite effectively. You can dub a voice when when the speaker is not facing camera or whatever, and they did. It was well done.
I totally agree, and I just wish that we'd known that this version existed. Nobody who was our age knew of the existence of this film, of this version of the film, until the reels were discovered very gradually in the 1980s.
Yes, as I remember, they were found in a laneway in Sydney somewhere.
Yeah, most of what survived was found in the laneway in inner Sydney. Actually out at Bondi or Bondi Junction.
Okay, yeah.
And another reel or two turned up in the NFSA collection, which is
okay. Yeah.
Which probably came in as part of the last film search or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was quite shocked when I first saw them when the reels actually turned up, and it's just one of those incredible survivals, that because how many prints of the sound version would have been made? Just one?
Oh, probably one, yeah. But look, I do believe that it wasn't distributed. It was certainly made available through a very minor distributor called Charles Hardy.
Yeah.
He offered it for screening, and but I found, at least through using Trove digitized newspapers and magazines, I found absolutely no reference to this version screening anywhere.
Yeah.
So that often accounts for the survival of the film. It hasn't literally been, worn out and
That's right.
it survives because it's never been run anywhere apart from occasional screenings by the distributor or the filmmakers.
Yeah. No, it's a very stylish film. It's the costumes, the way the sets are arranged and so on. It's very stylish to look at.
Yes,
yeah.
And look, the grand irony, of course, is that the poor McDonaghs, couldn't get a release for this version in 1929. And here it is, it's the only complete version of the Cheetahs that survives.
Yes.
And it's now being acclaimed around the world.
Yes.
It's just, but it shows you how fast moving and how skewed perceptions were of silent films in that sort of 1928 to 1931, 32 period, where even decent silent films were being disregarded. At least by the distributors. How the audiences would have dealt with it is another matter. But it seems that the silent, from the research I've done, is that the silent version of the Cheetahs was never released either at that time.
And the changing taste, there's a book called The Speed of Sound about the introduction of sound in Hollywood. And one of the sort of little side comments in it was when the Jazz Singer was released, people queued around the block, to sort of crowd in to see it in all the theatres where it was being shown. It's a huge commercial success. So 3 years later, Warner's reopened it at the original theatre and pulled it after 3 days. It was just, nobody wanted to see it. It was just, the world had moved on so quickly that it was old hat.
And it's interesting, on YouTube now, there are clips, there are very rarely full talkies from Warner's on YouTube, but there are clips from several of the gangster films that were made in the sort of 1928 to 1930 period. And they look very different, stylistically very different, and in terms of production values and just sheer filmmaking confidence, they look very different to what was suddenly being achieved in 1931, 32, 33 by Warner's. It was like a different studio.
Yeah.
So clearly the expertise moved very quickly as well.
Yes, yeah. Anyway, and so while all that was happening overseas, and these films were arriving in Australia in, I suppose, in a piecemeal fashion, being shown in some cinemas that had wired for sound and others that couldn't. And I wonder how Australian audiences reacted over a period of when were the Jazz Singer be first released in Australia? 27 or 28?
28. Yeah,
28.
I think it was August 1928, and so that it was Union Theatres who released the Jazz Singer, and it was Whites who released a film called The Red Dance, which was a talkie, and rather like Don Juan in that it was just effects and music.
Yeah.
Ironically, the Red Dance is now a lost film, but they were the two films that went head to head. But certainly, the Jazz Singer was massively popular in Australia.
Yeah, but it was not till the early 30s that all theatres were able to show sound films.
That's right, for a whole variety of reasons, including insulation and simply having the equipment and being able to afford the equipment as well. So there's a whole largely untold story of Australian inventors inventing Australian sound projectors, so that quite often struggling independent exhibitors could afford to buy the reproduction technology which enabled them to run talkies.
So the period has always fascinated me, and it shifted from in 1927, where Warner Brothers had played around with Vitaphone, with sound, with Don Juan and music and effects, and the other studios didn't want to know about it. Once the Jazz Singer, and sound films had actually been around for some years with Lee DeForest, but it just hadn't somehow clicked. And then it clicked with that film, and then they all had to follow suit very quickly, and it was all transformed. And and as you say, the filmmaking was reinvented quite quickly. They learned how to do it quite quickly. And a favourite, this is it goes off onto another tack, but for a number of years, I would teach at George Eastman House in the US, in in Rochester, New York. They have a school for film archivists. And as part of an exercise, we would run a film called The Lottery Bride, a Jeanette McDonald musical, made in 1929. And I looked at it and I think, is that really made in 1929? It was the production values was superb, but the music was recorded live. And so, you know, but it's all done, and it was hard to look at that and I think 2 years earlier they made The Jazz Singer in 1929. This very accomplished film with a Technicolor sequence with extraordinary opticals and so on, was made in 1929 and failed because by 1929 the all singing, all talking, all dancing films had run their course, and people were getting sick of musicals.
Yeah, it wasn't until Warner's came up with the Busby Berkeley spectaculars a few years later that the musicals were revived and stayed as a staple. Yeah. No, it's the coming of sound period fascinates me, and in fact, referring to YouTube again, on Forrest phono films, or biography actually of Lee DeForest, and a couple of, I think the movie's Loon to Talk is up on YouTube as well. There are two or three quite key docker I recommend. Yeah. Any thoughts or questions from your perspective, Gary?
Well, was actually talking about the changeover from silent to sound. The Vimeo version that was sent out for us to watch before this said at the start it was transferred at 16 frames a second, which did feel a bit slow because I played it at 1.25 speed. So I would guess 20 frames a second is probably about the speed it was shot at. Presumably the silent material in the sound versions would be speeded up a bit.
Yeah, I wondered about that as well. It was probably, I remember, I think it was Norman Dawn when I spoke to him, said that really by the coming of sound, a lot of people were filming 20, almost up to 24 frames. So it wouldn't have been a huge adjustment in that case. But I wondered if the McDonald's or anyone in converting to the standard tone version had to do any step or stretch printing. But I think that would have been a bridge too far at that time. In fact, I don't think anyone was aware of that particular technology.
Other thing I wanted to ask, is there a continuity error in this film? Because I'll probably need somebody who knows more about the history of the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, because about 10 minutes in, just after the 20 years later caption, there's a shot of the bridge which looks like it's almost complete.
Yeah.
And just over an hour when Lee's reading the letter that Paula has sent him, you can see a much less complete version of the bridge behind him.
I think that's just editorial sloppiness, quite frankly. I think that's probably been there all the way through. But yes, it is a glaring continuity error. I remember that occurred to me the first time I saw the films. But there are not too many, in other respects, I think certainly by the Cheetahs, and there's strong evidence in the Far Paradise as well that Paulette really knew screen grammar by then. Probably the only major thing is that in the Cheetahs silent version, there's only one tracking shot that I know of. Otherwise they don't move the camera very much.
There was a poster at the beginning of the session today showing a wharf. I'm almost certain that's Cabarita.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah. It's got
showing the wharf. You're talking about today's session where we've got
right when you started, yeah.
There was a film called Joe where you've got Isabel McDonagh and Gordon Collingridge standing side by side. Cabarita. Okay. I've always wondered where that wharf was. I thought it might have been in the eastern suburbs or somewhere like that.
No, it looks very much. It's got a very strange sort of path down to it, and the wharf is at the point. and you've got the zigzag path down to it. I've used that wharf a few times.
Okay. Oh, that's very possible because, you know, Drummoyne isn't that far from Cabarita.
No,
Would have been possible to get there quite easily. Yeah. Oh, very good. The sequence, the ballroom or restaurant sequence was Ambassador's Restaurant, which was below one of the Sydney CBD arcades, and that's long gone, but that existed for about 10 years, and there was quite the waiter who shows them to their table was a man called Tony Clarisi, and I remember the McDonoughs telling me that he was very well known as head waiter at Romano's later on. It was a restaurant that succeeded the Ambassadors. So there's so much of early Sydney which is fascinating, you know, for a filmmaking team that really wanted to have a mid-Pacific or a mid-Atlantic look. Sydney is very identifiable in a lot of sequences.
Well, to people who live in Sydney, yes, but I guess to anyone else, you know.
For anyone overseas, yeah. And the same could be said of films that are, you know, supposedly set in Chicago, which are shot in Sydney today.
Yeah, that's right. I think in Showgirl's Luck, there's also a shot of the partly completed Harbour Bridge.
There's a sequence shot down at Lavender Bay in a little shipyard that was there at that time. Well, Lavender Bay had its share of shipyards, so it was one of the shipyards there. That's true. Yes, and you know, inevitably in documentaries, some of the documentaries the McDonoughs made. One of the documentaries, I think, the Sydney Harbour Bridge is in the background.
Yeah.
Well, probably the Farlope one.
Well, Showgirl's Luck would have been almost contemporary in its production, wouldn't it?
Yeah, Showgirl's Luck was 1930-31, and so it really did. It was going through its production convulsions at about the same time as the Cheetahs. The Cheetahs being converted to sound anyway. Showgirl's Luck didn't go into production as early as 1929, which the Cheetahs had. But certainly Neville Mackin is the common factor between Showgirl's Luck and the Cheetahs, because as far as I recall, Mackin had started to fund Jack Fletcher, the cameraman, and Bill Shepherd, who was working for Jack Fletcher, to evolve the standard tone sound recording, sound on film process fairly early in the piece. And standard tone wasn't sufficiently developed to be used on the Cheetahs. And so they, in order to kind of make the Commonwealth competition, the Federal Film Prize, they went and did sound on disc.
Yeah.
But then, of course, it was sufficiently developed for Norman Dawn to be able to use it, Mackin to be able to put some, you know, money into Showgirl's Luck. I think he put a little bit of money into it as well as made the standard tone sound on film version available to Showgirl's Luck. So Showgirl's Luck, which had started sound on disc and it had some rather disastrous experiences with very poor sound on disc technology. Showgirl's Luck was then completed on sound on film using standard tone. And then it was after that the McDonoughs did the conversion of the Cheetahs to sound on film using standard tone technology as well. And a number of the short films the McDonoughs made as well were shot on sound on film.
So how does standard tone compare to the Cine sound system? Which
look, at the time it was judged to be fairly close, but because Arthur Smith was a trained sound technologist and knew a lot more about the science behind sound recording, Cinesound had that edge. But I wrote an article for History magazine, the Royal Australian Historical Society magazine, History, called Cinesound versus standard tone. It showed that at one stage competition between the two of them in the eyes of Stuart Doyle, who was the boss of Union Theatres and Australasian Film. Competition was fairly close, but it was just that, Cinesound pipped them at the post. The Smith, it's interesting because I also in the article referred to the Cinesound sound recording process, and Tony Buckley wrapped me over the knuckles and said, well, it actually wasn't called that at the time.
No.
The Smith and Cross process, because Arthur Smith and Clive Cross had been the inventors of it. And he said, Tony said there was no way that Arthur Smith was going to change the name, because he wanted to make that sound system as widely available as possible. So he didn't want it to exclusively go to theatres, Cinesound Productions, as they were.
Graham, you got any idea where that river crossing was?
The river crossing, good question. I've been trying to find out.
Right?
There's the Royal National Park is the closest I can get to it. I thought for a while it was at the Audley Weir, but it turns out it's not the Audley Weir. Somebody contacted me on Facebook and said that she thought it was another weir which no longer exists, which she'd found photographs of.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So that's that's as close as I've ever been to identifying that particular location. Beautiful looking location.
Yeah.
Do you know if there's any evidence that, any of the Madonna's films played outside Australia at the time?
I think that The Far Paradise did. I'm not 100% sure. I can check that actually. I think The Far Paradise ran in England.
I know somebody who could ask.
Oh, okay, because the Far Paradise is still missing a reel, a crucial reel actually, where a key murder occurs. You know,
I saw a showing of that about 6 years ago in London, because with the two Isabel's two sons present, and Trader Faulkner was also asking questions, part of the Q&A as well.
I wonder if there's another excellent copy.
So I saw a showing of Far Paradise in London about 6 years ago, with the Isabel's two sons and Trader Faulkner doing a Q&A afterwards. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting film, which is pity it's incomplete. But,
in some ways, it's got a lot more heart and soul than the Cheetahs. The Cheetahs is a crime melodrama, whereas a romantic melodrama. And there are some very powerful sequences in the that over the years that's had limited availability. Was that I think it was one of those films, and Ray will know this syndrome only too well, it was one of those films that was made available to the then National Library Film Division copy. They copied it.
You've dropped out there, Graham.
I've just looked up the BFI's collection site, and for the Cheetahs, it says it appears in
on 16mm. And the War Memorial.
Probably, yeah. There's a publication from 1934 called Film Booking and Ready Reference Guide, and it apparently appears in there. So, just to confuse us.
There was another film called The Cheetahs around that same time.
Yeah, the Warner Brothers thing. Yes, I suppose have to find out which one that reference is referring to.
Yes, to be able to differentiate.
What happened to Far Paradise was it was acquired by the National Library in, I guess, sometime in the 60s or earlier, and according to their practice at the time, it was copied onto 16mm through a sound gate, so that the top and bottom and one side of the picture is cropped, and then the nitrate was destroyed afterwards. That was the system at the time, which is appalling from today's perspective. So Far Paradise only survives in that that slightly mangled form. And of course, one reel was missing anyway. But and I don't know if there's any record of where the film actually came from at the time. I started work there in 1968, and that's the form which I encountered it, and there was no nitrate. So unfortunately, that it survives. It's imperfect in that form. The cheetahs, fortunately, I think the nitrate still exists.
Yeah, that's true. That was obtained from the Harry Davidson collection after Harry passed away in the 80s.
Oh, was it? Okay. Okay.
Previously, I think the archive had made a copy from a copy which Harry Davidson had allowed Roger Mackenzie to make. So
okay.
A couple of safety copies.
Right.
Yeah, generally.
Okay, that's the that's the archaeology of the collection, but it's very unfortunate that the nitrate was not kept of a lot of this material at the time, but there was no proper place to store it. It was stored in a sequence of temporary and most unsuitable storage places, and there was no actual nitrate vault, purpose-built nitrate vault, until about 1977.
And talking about storage spaces, one of them was the St Mary's Munitions Depot.
That's right. Yes. Well, I can. I will relate my early experience. I joined the film division of the National Library in December '68. One of my early experiences was this must be early '69. The nitrate collection was stored in this small brick vault at the back of the Australian War Memorial, and the War Memorial also had its own nitrate collection in another compartment. And the War Memorial was due to extend backwards, and so the vault had to be demolished. And so the National Library was told to get rid of its nitrate collection, put it somewhere else. There was nowhere else, and so there was a culling exercise. And I think Rod Wallace and Charles Gilbert and others went down there one day to reduce the size of the collection, with the intention that what was left would be sent off to be copied to 16mm, and then all the nitrate could be got rid of. And so there was a tip truck backed up, and we formed a human chain. And as each reel was passed out, somebody would look at a title, if there was a title on it, and decide to keep it or not, and otherwise just chuck it into the truck. And I was quite new, and I felt there was something terribly wrong about what was going on. And I kept saying, "Can we keep this? Can we keep this?" And so eventually we ended up with 856 cans instead of 400. And the rest went off to a tip somewhere in Canberra, where it no doubt still is. And that was put back into this brick building. And then it seemed that the plans to demolish the vault slowed down. And then suddenly Doug McClellan, Senator Doug McClellan, got up and asked a bunch of questions in the Senate about the National Library's nitrate film and how it was being looked after, and whether there was sufficient preservation funds. It's all in Hansard. He was extremely well informed. And in the meantime, I had been suddenly sent off to find some place in Sydney to store the nitrate. And that's how I came across the munitions filling factory at St Mary's, where we're given a sort of a bunker, which if the factory was a sequence of small separate buildings meant for storing explosives, so that if one building went up, well, the rest didn't. And so we were given one of those, and the nitrate was eventually put in a truck, set off down the highway. We wouldn't be allowed to do this today, I don't think. So there was this sort of truck full of nitrate film, just zooming down the highway, and it was supposed to arrive at the other end of St Mary's, and didn't turn up. And so there was much frantic phone calling to find out what had happened. And apparently the brakes had failed on the truck, and it had found its way to a garage. I mean, I was wondering if it sort of crashed somewhere and there'd been some, inferno on the highway. It found its way to a garage. The owner of the garage was told what the cargo was, and that it could incinerate his entire premises if it went up. And gee, those brakes were fixed quickly. And it was then delivered to St Mary's. So, but anyway, St Mary's served as the nitrate store, and it was not air conditioned. It was just a building, cold in winter, hot in summer, until there actually was a purpose-built building. I think in about 1977. So we were a long way behind other countries in looking after a nitrate film, but at least by that stage we were not burning nitrate after being copied, and we were copying it onto 35mm by that stage, not on 16mm. That's kind of part of the sad story.
Yeah, among the other key silent films, or I think it's a key silent film, which was reduction copied to 16mm, was Sunshine Sally, which I think is a beautiful film. Gem of the film. Once again, that's missing a little bit towards the end, not as much as a reel. It's just, there are probably 2 or 3 key minutes of a flashback sequence, which are missing. But apart from that, wonderful film. And certainly, in hindsight, one wishes it had been kept on 35.
Yeah, but that was the way things were seen then, because copying a film cost a lot more than buying a bunch of books. So that was the comparison that was always made. And so the activity was not terribly popular within the National Library. But that's a very long story, isn't it, Graham?
Yes, it is. It is indeed. Yeah.
There was also an interesting story, wasn't there, about where the Library of Congress kept its nitrates. Came up at that conference that was held here in Canberra. Library of Congress people were using Mavis for their cataloguing, and the guy told the story about some mountain outside Washington where they discovered they could, a bunker of some sort of a atomic or pre-atomic bunker, and they were able to use it for all their nitrates.
Okay, I don't recall that one, but yeah, I mean, all sorts of things were resorted to. Other countries, basically, certainly in Europe, as early as the 40s and 50s, they were building stores specifically for housing nitrate film, which allowed for the fire risk and made some attempt at proper temperature and humidity. And in 1973, when I went to the FIAF summer school in East Berlin, of all places, which was a showpiece archive with utterly superb storage, and with nitrate at whatever, anyway, the correct temperature and humidity. And it's one of the curiosities of history that the communist countries actually looked after their film history pretty well, spent money on it, whereas we didn't. And so it was a logical place for running such a training school, because they had the facilities to show off. And the nitrate film was stored not only not only was the building designed correctly, but the cans were put inside. You'd have about something like 10 cans inside a kind of a locker arrangement, so that if anything caught fire, it would be very, very contained, and not just on open shelves. So Europeans and I think the Americans at some stage were, they were quite sophisticated in the way they stored nitrate film, but we were not.
Yeah, thank you.
We're into 3:15. We can go on for a bit longer, but are there other questions you'd like to raise? Anyone?
I just wanted to make the final point, just getting back to what you were saying about the post-synchronizing of dialogue on the Cheetahs. I agree, Ray. I think it was just absolutely an extraordinary achievement, really, because for a long time afterwards, there was the whole process of looping, where you would have a loop of film, just a brief sequence, where actors would perfect the recording for that loop of film, the re-recording of dialogue, that is. But this one appears to have been virtually flawless. That's why I'm really, lamenting the fact that there is no one still around to explain how they did it.
Yeah, how did they do it? I don't know.
I think it was a live read, and I think they probably had as many people in the room as possible contributing voices. And there were probably some people who had India rubber voices who could do more than one or two voices.
Yeah.
But I just, it was recording on sound on film, which wouldn't have been cheap.
Mm.
And they did it to some kind of playback, but it must have taken ages. It either took ages or they winged it and it came out as.
Because you couldn't stop, start, and so it would be very, and it would be expensive to mess around and stop and start and so on. You'd have to do it,
Look, there are individual sequences, and they'd have to include the ambassador's restaurant sequence in the film, which really benefit from post-synchronization. But there's a strange disparity between the rather archaic nature of replicating intertitles and some of the more free-form dialogue, the incidental bits and pieces, which are much more naturalistic. And the other thing is that in adding sound to sequences which were conceived for the silent film, that really kind of, I think, mucked up the pacing of the silent, of what had originally been the silent. So if you compare the impact of the silent with that sound on film version, I still far prefer the silent.
Yeah.
It would be typical of Australia, however, up until about the 50s or 60s at least, due to our isolation in the world, we didn't know any better than to be perfectionist. And inventions and things like that were created in Australia in the electronics field that I'm aware of came about partly because we didn't know that the others weren't anything like as good as us, and we just kept on perfecting it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm. And that's continued at a less publicly aware level, but I think Australian inventiveness has continued. I mean, the stories one hears about Arthur Higgins, the cameraman, and he had Alec Ezard, who was a makeup man turned editor who worked with Arthur Higgins in the late 1930s, recalled Arthur Higgins with a beaker full of chemicals, creating a fade at the end of a scene of a film and timing it out by singing the Cherry Ripe ditty. And when he reached the end of the first stanza, it was sufficiently cooked and it was fine, and apparently it was.
Yeah. No, I think you dip the negative in like this and then pull it out again. Right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it worked.
It did. It did.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we might sort of call a halt to that. Thank you all for attending and being able to get this this webinar now down and record on the website. And thank you for giving up time this afternoon when there's so many other attractions going on around us.
Thank you for getting up so early, Gary.
Yeah.
Enjoy the rest of your night's sleep.
Yeah, no worries. I'll probably go back for another hour and a half.
Right.
So it's only just got a job 6:20 in the morning now.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all. we'll call a collision to it there.
Okay,
Thanks, Brian.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Brian.
Right. Good.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.